Chapter 13 of Hunters Out of Space. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elliot Miller. Hunters Out of Space by Joseph E. Kelliam. Chapter 13. The dust cloud was farther away than Ato had guessed. Long before they reached it, his instruments began to waver. He looked at a star map. Meanwhile, Nia fed rows of figures into a humming calculator. "We'll never make it this way," Ato said. "Not even the emergency storage would help us here." He pointed to a pinpoint of light upon the map. "A white star. We can reach it, I think." Nia sighed. "That dust cloud is beyond our calculations. We should be nearly there, but it's still far off. I think it is shrinking and expanding. At the same time it's dashing off into space at a terrific rate of speed. You'll have to swing toward that star, Ato. I'll try to probe the cloud some more. My father would have liked this problem." "I don't like the problem at all," Gunnar complained. "Just where's Grim Hagen?" "He must be having as much trouble beating his way to that dust cloud as we are," Ato assured him. And then, doubtfully, he added, "But he has more energy. The old spaceship was sitting there below Aldebaran for years and years. He surely took advantage of the time to replenish his fuel. All the while, we were using ours up in an effort to find him." Jack Odin's science did not go far enough to pursue the conversation. He knew that their power was something like a solar battery. When in gear, the current that went through the frame of the hourglass-shaped craft turned into a huge blob of plasma, a miniature nebula, and hurled it into space. As for the fourth drive, he hadn't the slightest idea how that worked. Ato had said that the scientists who developed it were not sure. Just as men had developed generators long before they knew the laws that governed them. Ato had a theory that the fourth gear slid the ship from plane to plane. If a bug were crawling along a million-mile spiral of wire, he might go on until he died before getting anywhere. But if he simply lumbered across the intervening space to the next coil, would he have traveled a short distance or a million miles? Ato had also told Odin that the ship took energy from the gravitational field that it created while traveling at a tremendous speed, so that the motors were 99% efficient. Ato set a course for the distant star, and in a short while it was looming upon the screen with sheets of atomic flame leaping out like the teeth of a circular saw. One huge explosion flicked a long tongue of heat at them. The corona of the sun gleamed and writhed like a thin band of quicksilver. "We're going in there," Ato decided. "It's the quickest way." Warnings were sounded all through the ship. The screens were turned off now, as no eye could have survived the sight of that flaming ball which was rushing toward them at such extraordinary speed. The ship groaned as it hit the corona. Vast whirlwinds of flame shook it. The motors coughed and spat. Then the gyroscopes took over. It steadied itself and went through. Like a moth fluttering through a candle flame, the nebula drew away from the star. But this moth was unharmed, and a million cells had drunk so much energy that the ship reeled with its power. On and on. In a zigzag pursuit of Grim Hagen, they crashed through trans space. The dust cloud loomed larger now upon their screens. It was still no larger than a baseball, though it must have been millions of miles across. 3 times they had to sweep from their course to renew their energy from a straggling sun that seemed to be farther and farther apart. The first was a tiny blue sun that burned its way through the emptiness. The second was a huge nebula that pulsed and spouted flame and protean worlds into space, enveloped again as it breathed, scarred them, and cast them out once more. and Odin wondered if in such a furnace and such torment his own world had been born. He had now seen as much of space as any man, with the exception of Grim Hagen, and so far it had been a tumultuous creation that he had watched. Nothing was still. The forges of space were white hot. As they sped toward the sun they passed two planets perilously close together, pelting each other with splashing gobs and spears of flame and slag. The third was a red sun with lonely, burnt-out planets circling wearily about it. As they skimmed above its surface, Odin slid a dark plate over the screen and watched. Here were molten lakes of metal rimmed by red flames that looked like writhing trees. The surface was splitting and bubbling. A mountain of molten ooze swiftly grew to a height of 30 miles. Then it burst into red flame from its own weight and came toppling down. As they hurled away from the red star, Ato turned to Odin and Gunnar and said, "I'm afraid that will be the last. Even the stars are behind us." The screens now showed nothing but the dust cloud, with specks of light and coils of darkness threaded through it. It loomed larger and larger until it filled the screen. "Ragnarok," Gunnar growled in his throat. He adjusted the shoulder strap that harnessed his broadsword to his back and looked at Odin curiously. "You should have rest, Norse King. You look gaunt and tired, but stronger too. I wonder if I have changed as much as you since we started this trip, eh, Norse King?" He chuckled. "If you had but one eye, I'd swear you were old Odin himself, rushing out to the edge of space to start that last bonfire of suns."
"Quiet," Nea pleaded as she worked with the calculator. "So far this has defied computation. It's unstable, Ato. Before I can identify it, a factor is added or taken away."
"Grim Hagen went in there," Ato replied as he studied his instruments. "If he can, we can."
"Perhaps," she answered. "But space out there is curdling in his wake."
She shivered. Nea's shoulders were beautifully shaped and Odin found himself thinking that they were made for a man's arms instead of bending over calculators and machines. "Oh well," he thought. "They are not for my arms, but why doesn't Ato wake up and claim her? Then there wouldn't be distractions like this." With one warning blare, the nebula plunged into the fringe of the dust cloud. The boat rocked. A splattering sound like the falling of heavy sleet filled the control room. Needles jumped and wheeled. Dials turned madly, spun back and forth and jammed. The lights flickered on and off. For a time they were in darkness. Then the lights came back, but continued their flickering. The screens were dark. Nea worked with the instruments. When power enough was available, she began probing the dust cloud as though nothing had happened. Then she fed more figures into the calculator and handed the result to Ato.
"Try this," she said in a tremulous voice. "It may work."
Ato took the tape from her hands and set the controls accordingly. The lights dimmed again, came on, and remained steady. The expanse of dim yellow light through which coils and ellipses of darkness crawled like black worms. Odin knew that such a feeling was impossible out here, but it seemed to him that the nebula leapt forward. Ato cried out in triumph. "I've got another fix on Grim Hagen. He's much nearer now."
"Hurry, Ato, hurry,"
Nea was pleading. They drove on and on. The screens remained as before, yellow light and crawling shadows. Then, suddenly, the screens were filled with dancing circles of flame. They blazed brightly, and thrust out little fiery arms and took their neighbors' hands. They danced. They gleamed and glistened. They became circles of flame. They grew toward each other and ran together into little puddles of light.
"Ato, hurry!"
Nea screamed. One of her instruments melted as she stared into it, and she jumped back, her hands to her eyes. Then they were out of the cloud, and space lay empty and free before them. with only one tiny sun in view.